If you're new in town or just new to this whole podcast thing, you're tuning in to Law by Night, the podcast that discusses all things vampiric with no fear of breaching the Masquerade. In this episode, we shall review The Guide to the Anarchs, a sourcebook for Vampire the Masquerade. I shall present my thoughts and opinions on its presentation and mechanics to help you better decide whether this is the sourcebook for you. Just over a year ago at the time of recording, we had a look at the Camarilla and Anarch books for Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition. Those who have listened to episodes 86 and 87 of the Law by Night podcast will know that I felt both books did not live up to their full potential. What was provided was useful if rather fleeting and vague, ultimately serving as interesting coffee table books. Whilst they were flawed and disappointing tomes, at least they provided some small and minor elements for both storytellers and players. Sabbat the Black Hand was, in my opinion, a disorganised, contradictory mess from start to finish that failed to progress the Sword of Cain in any meaningful manner beyond the boring bite, stab, kill, slurp stereotype, as I explored in fuller detail in my review of that book at the tail end of March 2022, which was a few months ago as of the recording of this episode. Those, however, are not the only source books for those three sects, as you may have gathered by the title of this episode. 3 books were released for the revised edition of Vampire the Masquerade. The last of these, Guide to the Anarchs, was released in 18th of March 2002 and was the first in-depth guide to the Anarchs, providing the history, politics, secrets and organisation of the Anarch movement, the third largest kindred sect, as of the creation of that book at least. It is a pretty big claim, as many would wager that there's actually very little history around them. Of course, someone has to test that statement, and that person just so happens to be me. Does this claim hold up? And can and should newer players and storytellers from newer installments of Vampire the Masquerade use this for their sessions? But before we dive into the book review proper, here are the rules to the Law by Night book reviews. I will explore snippets of the lore, mechanics and rules found within the tome. I will look as to how they are presented and easily they are conveyed to new and old players alike. As this is a review written and presented by me, all thoughts and opinions are my own, so if you disagree with something I have said, that is totally fine. It does not mean that you're right and I am wrong and vice versa. A good place to start with anything is at the beginning, which has a start with the physical book itself, which currently sits neatly upon my lap. It is a letter-sized hardback book with the infamous green marble pattern, like practically every Vampire the Masquerade core book before then and everything else in the V20 line after it. It is made of a slightly squishy hardback sort of material, like some sort of cardboard maybe, that is somewhat harder than its vanilla counterpart, but it is a tome that will mark easily all the same. Being a source book, it is also much smaller than any accompanying core book. On the front cover is an interesting illustration of vampires of varying genders and ages, all anarchs in stereotypical street clothes for the most part, whilst one is in light combat armours. Together, they are pulling at chains and wooden poles against the backdrop of a ruined American flag. One of these vampires, a much older male, makes me think that he could be Jeremy McNeil, but the fact that he has chains around his neck made me question this. Perhaps it is a metaphor for the Anarchs, being as free as they think they are still bound to the whims of the Camarilla. Perhaps it is someone pulling into action, a metaphor for his fate, bound to the Anarchs despite not wanting to rule them. This of course sits on top of the infamous green marble that is Vampire the Masquerade, with a clearly scanned-in version of the blurb straight onto the back, with the ye olde revised Anarch Ankh in the centre, which is stylised as if it is part of the green marble. The front cover itself is not centred going too far over to the right, which is something that irritates me greatly. I will mention at this point that, like most of my TTRPG purchases, my copy of Guide to the Anarchs came from DriveThruRPG, so whilst the printing of my copy was clear, yours may differ. To that end, the art found within the book varies in style and clarity, to busy black and white scenes that dominate the start of each chapter, to more intense and aggressive sketches with occasional comic book styled pieces, which I usually wouldn't like so much in Vampire, but I feel was more fitting given the naturally energetic nature of the Anarchs. The portraits done in the first appendix are fucking awful to look at, and not Nosferatu awful either, just fucking butt ugly. When you open the book, you are greeted almost immediately with the standard introduction chapter, which details what the book aims to cover and what you will find inside. It makes it very clear that the Anarchs, as presented in Revised Edition, are not totally independent from the Camarilla. They are a part of the Camarilla, who pay lip service to most of the traditions, whilst upholding the Masquerade. It addresses the fact that many players have a very narrow-minded outlook on the Anarchs, and how they lack substance. They lack the structure of the Camarilla, and are too scared to rebel as hard as the Sabbat. The Anarchs, as we know in the 21st century, agreed to the Convention of Thorns, but were allowed to uphold their beliefs, which is partly why they were not seen as much as a threat to the Camarilla as the Sabbat are. The Anarchs of yesterday catapulted the politics and culture of vampires in the world of darkness as we know it today. All of those themes are explored within the first few pages of the book, as well as a handy lexicon as of current, as of 1999, vulgar and old-form phrases / slang you may hear in the Anarchs. It is interesting to learn that an Anarch coterie is referred to as a pack. Chapter 1 is a history of the Anarch movement, which details just that in what is perhaps the least biased retelling of the revolt, which makes this a fairly lengthy history lesson easier to read. The Camarilla would perhaps word it as pesky rapscallions needing to be reined in before all vampiric kind are snuffed out of existence. The Sabbat would proclaim loudly that it came about when the La Sombra and Tzimisce antediluvians were devoured. Whilst both of those points are true to an extent, the reality is, according to this book at least, it was mainly Spanish bourgeois neonates that had gone enough is enough and rebelled against some corrupt elders in various fiefdoms. The fires of the Anarch revolt were kindling away for some 10 years before the Tzimisce and La Sombra really kickstarted things. The chapter also goes through the main revolt itself, the resistance put up by the church, and the Convention of Thorns, which is detailed in full, taking up most of page 18, something I praised Mind's Eye Theatre VTM's LARP book for, which is the first book reviewed on the podcast. It is interesting to note how the Anarchs, or at the very least whoever the narrator is, acknowledges Harderstadt's true identity, or at the very least hints at it, as well as the disorganization of the Camarilla during its establishment. The chapter ends with information on the Anarchs' involvement with the French Revolution and an account of the formation of the Anarch Free States in riveting detail, including the status perfectus, written out in a similar fashion as the Convention of Thorns was previously. I'll let you discover that nugget by yourself. That said, it felt the Anarch Free State section was a little rushed, like they were setting up that later in a later book, which is a shame, given how important it is to the history of the Anarchs. Following this is where the Guide to the Anarchs feels like a more traditional World of Darkness sourcebook, as the second chapter looks more at the Anarchs themselves, starting with the main clans, minus the Stethites, Giovanni and Tzimisce, in the traditional ye old character creation format you have seen time and time again. That is, assuming you are an older fan of course, and you are familiar with the double-page spread. These are not anti-tribute vampires, they are essentially cast-offs and fuck-ups of their main counterparts. To that end, I find the inclusion of the La Sombra here to be very interesting. For the hate of the La Sombra anti-tribute get in the Camarilla, it pales in comparison to what Anarch La Sombra endure. The reason being is that the La Sombra on either side came to negotiate, not to surrender, which is essentially with what the remaining Anarchs did. Cam or Sabbat, you made your choice. Anarch La Sombra are seen as weak or not fully committing to a side, and you are seen as a threat for this reason too. I have no intention of talking about every clan right up here, as players and STs can find some interesting pieces found in most of these pages. I will mention that there are some differences in some of the clan weaknesses, like the Assamite's bloodlust and the Bluhar's anger, which mechanically manifest in the form of a slightly higher difficulty to resist. The social flaw of the Kaitif is non-existent in the Anarchs because why would they care? Your clan doesn't define who you are as a person, your beliefs do, which is a message that everyone should adopt really. Similar to the previous book review I did, Guide to the Camarilla, I find it interesting that the book suggests that Kaitif disciplines default to fortitude, potence and presence if you are unable to come up with three by yourself. Following this, the chapter breaks down and expands on the various roles within the Anarchs, like the Baron, Sweeper and so forth, as well as the Anarch views on the Camarilla positions and power and the traditions. Of course, course, it does not take much to see that the Anarchs in terms of leadership are a watered-down Camarilla. The Anarchs don't mind the notion of Prince and Primogen, they in concept work really well, it is the politics they can't stand. Because they are part of the Camarilla, they are enemies of the Sabbat. The Sword of Cain, however, are more willing to negotiate because they're somewhat more detached from the Ivory Tower than Camarilla proper. Negotiations are a pinch easier and are more straightforward to manipulate because of this. That said, the Anarchs bitterly oppose the Sabbat and everything they stand for, to quote the book directly. Information is provided on the Anarchs' look on the Kuei-Jin faction in LA, called the New Promised Mandarinate, or something like that, which is interesting for those who want to bring the Kindred of the East material into their games. Besides that, the whole idea of the Asians invading the US, the threat of the Yellow Peril as it's so been dubbed in grander media, is incredibly racist, especially with how it's presented here, the Anarchs' total hostility towards them for just existing. Yes, there is rocky lore regarding this, but that doesn't change the poorly written and executed racial tensions, especially when it's stated that the Camarilla and Sabbat give no shits unless war breaks out. The Kuei-Jin are not the only supernaturals discussed. The Anarchs either don't believe or know much about them, besides hunters and werewolves, especially the latter, as many Anarchs adopt nomadic lifestyles, as explored in the third and final appendix, which is a fairly lengthy appendix chapter, which built the foundations for some of the more interesting ideas in the V5 Anarch book. But returning to the second chapter, it ends with the rest of their culture, from ghouls, chowder, and how to join the Anarchs. Like the Sabbat, the Anarchs have their own games. Unlike the Sabbat, there is little visceral bloodshed, and they are more tame. For the most part. A particular favourite of mine is bear baiting, which involves talking, taunting or provoking an elder into an inappropriate outburst or frenzy. It's a very ballsy game, and I love the chaotic nature of it. Chapter 3 is all about character creation, which is a chapter I don't feel I need to go through too much, given all the extensive character creation and how-to guides I have done. That being said, this chapter does have some extra flavour if you're trying to build a younger, less experienced member of the Anarch movement. A lot of information is provided to get the players and STs into the Anarch mindset, as well as in the shoes of your character. The number of attributes and abilities you gain are slightly less than the Camarilla equivalent, but they gain 4 discipline dots rather than 3 like the Sabbat. The Anarchs are weaker than the Camarilla vampires, but they are closer to their instincts than the Sabbat are. As minimal as these changes are, I like how it makes that much more personal. The next chapter is a very large chapter on kindred from all over the world, and when I say all over the world, I do literally mean every major country worth writing about from all the continents. If you didn't feel the need to care previously, this chapter will do its utmost best to make you care now. It is all written in the form of a letter, from one kindred to another, and some of the descriptors of places and sects are somewhat more biased than before, but this is understandable, given the author is an Anarch. It is a very useful chapter, primarily for storytellers to create their games and settings, but lacks the funds of an existing and/or non-existing City by Night book. Whilst it would be ridiculous for me to comb through 38 pages of lore and world building, I would personally like to have seen a bit more information about the UK, particularly with the punk movement colouring the Anarchs. A biased gripe, but a gripe all the same, as not all the locations are detailed equally. This leads nicely onto the 5th chapter, which is all about storytelling, which naturally has a very different direction to Camarilla and Sabbat-focused games. Themes of survival, revolution, the old versus new, and challenging the established hierarchy make up the general go-to moods of Anarch games. It also touches upon the use of technology, economics, and politics in ways the other two sects don't, as the Anarchs are generally seen as more as their rivals. The gripe on technology is often seen as better, they have better touch with the common man as it were, and money is not so readily available, for the movement is not exactly known for indulging in the old foe of capitalism. Chapter 6 is an interesting chapter on disciplines and their usage within the Anarch movement. Whilst most of the chapter is made up of a multitude of powerful combination discipline powers, where the chapter really shines with its beginning as it talks about the culture of learning and nurturing disciplines, how they use them for protection, hunting, and how it differs from the Camarilla's sires, teaching their children what they need to know in order to survive, but not so much so they can easily overthrow them. The first 3 pages are very useful for any setting of Vampire the Masquerade. Next is the first of 3 appendices, the third one we discussed previously. Appendix 1 is simply titled Allies, Antagonists and Others, and is filled with, well, allies, antagonists, and others. It is essentially a huge pool of nameless NPCs fulfilling every position of power in the Anarchs, plus some additional ones that you can discover for yourself. It's great to call upon one of these examples if your players do something totally unexpected and you weren't prepared for it, you're a brand new ST and are feeling unfamiliar with how to go about balancing stats for characters, something that some of the more recent V5 books do dreadfully, or you're an experienced ST and just don't have the time or energy to stat your NPCs. It works great for wanting one-shots and convention games. The second and last appendix to receive attention in this review is about intellectuals of the movement, something that generally does not immediately spring to minds of most VTM players when they think of the Anarchs. Elder vampires and the Anarchs are explored, both overall and expanding information presented in previous chapters, in great detail, almost as if you're peering behind some exclusive curtain. It is a particularly interesting section of the chapter on how to use them in games as NPCs when dealing with other vampires and mortals. It is filled with lots of information, but I wouldn't want to spoil the readers too much now, would I? And that, to me at least, feels like a weird flaw in of itself. Guide to the Anarchs is just over 200 pages long, and despite the push to make them a bigger, more dominant force in the setting for Vampire through Revised and into V5, I do not see the average Anarch fan reading all of this fairly. It's simply not needed for most players to know a lot of the information presented in this book. I suspect most would gravitate towards the small pool of powers and the character creation stuff and be done with it, not caring for the rest. I know some newer V5 players are scared of the green marble and the misinformation that older/legacy stuff encourages power gaming, but that is simply not true. Your iteration of the Anarchs you love so much comes from this and many other books. Some of them be bad, some of them may be good, but some are great. Guide to the Anarchs is without a shadow of a doubt an essential purchase for any Vampire the Masquerade fan, regardless of where your vampiric loyalties lie. If you're a Camarilla fan who wants to understand the inner political workings and how the former subsidiary works beyond neonates in street clothes clashing and shouting loudly, or perhaps you want to learn some history so you don't seem too draconian, get this book. Sabbat fans should get this book because they are proud of their history, embellish themselves and their roots, and know where they came from. And of course, the Anarch fans. Perhaps a bit on the wordy side, this book is ultimately for you. If you want a different way to look at the perspective, to know that deeply personal feeling that you own the night and want to learn how to act accordingly as an Anarch through and through, this is a must-own book. It is an underrated, diverse tome for all sorts of settings and character creation. And for those of you who are new to the Lord by Night brand and the reviews I occasionally do, I do not do out of 10 scores because they are subjectively pointless. One person's 10 out of 10 is another's 3 out of 5 stars, which is another's minus 42 out of 100, so I shall rate this book the nice score of 69s out of 10, as that is just as helpful as a proper out of 10 score. To be kept updated, follow the Lore by Night VTM Twitter and Instagram pages to find out when we will upload each episode. You can also find out by subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking on the little bell, as you'll be immediately notified when the latest episode is live. Until next time, farewell.